My daughter wants to eat a woman who has the same birthday as her. The only way this is going to make sense is if I start at the beginning. On August 21st, 1982. In the early hours of the morning, a girl was born. I was the attending on the same labor and delivery floor, not the mother's physician. The newborn's APGAR score was good, but it was obvious that she was in a lot of pain. The pediatrician on call hurried the child to the NICU. 20 minutes later, I received a call for advice. You want that I check on the mother, right? /2 I practice midwifery. I deliver babies and care for expectant mothers. The newborns are treated as pediatric patients once they are born. I was called into the neonatal unit, but why? Dr. Kaizen, I object. It's the child. Come to the NICU, please. I could hear my colleague's voice trembling. Screaming, the infant was in an incubator in the NICU. The nursing staff was far away. They were all not focusing on the kid. They either fixed their gaze on the ground, the far wall, or me. These neonatal ICU nurses had plenty of experience. Every terrible condition that could have arisen from birth had been dealt with by them. Whatever was inside the incubator, though, had frightened them. Why is this a case of obstetrics exactly? The pediatrician pointed to the incubator. Dr. Kaizen, please examine the patient and let me know what you think. The infant girl appeared to weigh around 8 pounds, which is a healthy birth weight, but her stomach was horribly swollen. She undoubtedly had a valid reason to scream. I gently prodded the girl's bulging belly, hoping to detect any fluid or gas. Not me. I experienced an enlarged womb instead. The infant's sternum was not far from the fundus. I used my fingertips to simulate what my whole hands feel in adult patients as I gently squeezed the sides of the child's belly. I touched her tiny belly with my palm. A barely perceptible flutter followed by a light push against my hand happened. I looked at the NICU personnel. Their hands were holding their mouths or touching their foreheads while their eyes were fixed on me. This child is pregnant, I declared. She is going into labor. I tried to keep my composure, but I could hear my voice trembling as I spoke. This newborn had something inside of it. As she developed inside the womb, something grew inside of her and was itching to come out. I am as familiar with the terrible consequences of abnormal pregnancies as the NICU nurses. I had never experienced the emotion of fear I was experiencing at that precise moment, regardless of the condition my patients and their fetuses had. Fear of the contents of this infant. I performed a CA, section on the baby. Due to the mother's infant status, the procedure, which would typically be carried out on an adult to deliver a child of average size, was challenging and time-consuming. I finished and took the infant's child in my arms. A tiny baby girl, 2 inches long, but fully formed and still very much alive. My fear vanished, and a more commonplace sense of worry took its place. This impossible little baby who had given me anxiety just 2 hours earlier was ultimately still a baby. She required attention. Extreme measures are needed to keep the lives of premature babies, or kids who are born several months early. For instance, it takes nearly 9 months for the lungs to develop. Premature infants, even those as tiny as the one I delivered, always need breathing support. However, this infant's breathing was normal. She had good color. She sobbed as usual. Her lungs had gone through their full 9-month growth cycle. This child had somehow been conceived almost at the same time as her mother, and she had spent 9 months growing inside one of her parents, who were also expecting. Of course, this is not possible. What brought you here? After I carefully placed her in her own NICU incubator, I questioned her. Don't respond to that, I advised. I think not knowing will be better for me. The grandmother, a 22-year-old who gave birth to a baby while pregnant, had no interest in the miraculous daughter her new child had given birth to. She described her granddaughter as the excess tissue you removed from my baby. The grandchild never gained the trust of the NICU nurses. While they took the bare minimum steps to maintain her health, they didn't lavish her with love and care the way they did with their other young patients. Despite not being religious, I do hold the notion of universal balance to be true, individually and cosmically. My wife's death from an aneurysm 3 years prior threw my life into disarray. This little girl, who was born to a nursing mother and was referred to as excess tissue, gave me direction. She seemed to be heading in the direction of the equilibrium I had lost. I took her in. I dubbed her Helen. I knew I had to keep Helen's birth circumstances a secret because of the grandmother's reaction. and the cold, impersonal care Helen received from the NICU nurses. How would the rest of the world treat Helen if her grandmother and the nursing staff couldn't see her as a person? Helen was born prematurely to a mother who was unable to raise her, according to the adoption papers. This is accurate. How could her mother, who was still a baby, raise a new baby? According to the paperwork, the family had no interest in the child, also true. It was not mentioned that Helen's mother was only 90 minutes older than Helen. Both a maternity and paternity test were necessary for the adoption process. The adoption must receive both parents' consent. We tested Helen's mother, the infant, her grandmother, the 22-year-old new mother, and her husband because of her unusual past. The DNA test established that Helen's mother was in fact the child who carried Helen. Grandparents to Helen were the mother, 22, and her husband. Amazing implications follow. Some unidentified male DNA entered her mother, who had not yet given birth, 9 months before Helen was born. Helen was created when that DNA joined the mother's in some way. Helen was born, and I raised her. She was an ordinary child, mostly. I don't want to minimize or downplay our wonderful years spent together. Please try to visualize a single father successfully raising a lovely, intelligent, and active daughter. Now that I know what Helen has become, the events I've described here stand out even more. Were these cautionary messages ones I disregarded or dismissed as a product of Helen's wild imagination? Helen was 8 years old when the first incident occurred. At the food court in the mall, we were having lunch. I waited for her to answer as I continued to speak to her. Not her. She was completely absorbed in something on the opposite side of the seating area. I whirled around and met her eyes. About Helen's age, another girl waited in line with her mother to order pizza. When I recognized the mother, I felt sick to my stomach. Helen's grandmother was someone I had only briefly met, but I was still able to recall her appearance. It was Helen's mother, now a little girl, who placed the pizza order. Grandmother Helen was the lady. At that time, Helen had no idea that she was adopted. Helen, why are you staring at those people? I'm looking at that girl. I wish I could eat her. Why? Why do you want to eat someone else? Not anybody, Dad. Only her. Helen, that is not the proper thing to say. I know, but it might help me get out one day. Get out? Of what? She never answered. When Helen was 10 years old, she visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and experienced the second strange occurrence. Together, we explored the galleries. I was more interested in Helen's interest than the art itself. I was curious as to what she found inspiring and what she found boring. We found ourselves in front of an oil painting from the 19th century that showed Christ entering hell. The gloomy picture depicted a barren landscape, a city on fire filled with the dead, monsters, demons, the river Styx, and of course, Jesus himself slamming the gate to hell in order to free the souls of the just, a phrase used by the artist. Helen came to a sudden halt in front of the picture. She approached it while paying the painting such close attention that her nose almost touched the canvas. She paid close attention to every little thing, carefully moving from one figure or feature to the next so she wouldn't miss anything. She then carefully examined the illustration of Christ slamming the door to hell. She giggled at first, then burst out laughing. What's so funny? I wasn't worried at that point, just curious. The picture is so silly. Christ's descent into hell is silly? The gate is silly. The gate is the way out of hell, not into it. You don't need to break in. You need to break out. It's just so funny. Plus, the door isn't big enough. I was now concerned. In my subconscious mind, I saw Helen's mother screaming while holding Helen inside of her in the NICU incubator. The fear that I experienced when I felt Helen kicking in her mother's miniature womb flooded me. Helen, what are you talking about? When I go to hell, I'm going to eat my way out, through my bloodline. Helen, why do you think you're going to hell? That's a very sad thing for a little girl to believe. It's just something I know. I remember it, even though it hasn't happened yet. Then she skipped away to the next gallery of paintings. The last incident that sticks out in retrospect as a potential warning sign occurred 7 years ago. While Helen was working on her postdoctoral project at Lawrence Livermore, she took the Christmas break to visit her family. Helen was a workaholic. Even when she was on vacation, she was always working. During the time she was home that year, she worked even more intensely than usual, and that's saying a lot. She earned a physics PhD from Caltech in just 3 years. I don't think she worked fewer than 12 hours a day even once during those 3 years. I was happy she was home, but she was so focused on a lab-related problem that it was more like having a cardboard cutout of my daughter visiting me than an actual person. For nearly a week, all my attempts to start a conversation failed. She'd respond with one-syllable answers to my questions and immediately curl back around her notebook. Finally, I asked her what she was working on. She stared at me, blinking for a minute. Her mind slowly descended from the world of high-energy physics to the world of normal human interaction. "Oh, sure." She handed me her notebook, a hardcover journal with the word record stenciled on the front. I opened the book to the page she had been writing on. The only way I can describe what I saw there was that it was satanic. A pentagram, an upside-down star inscribed in a circle filled half the page. The rest was filled with intricately drawn symbols, strange curving shapes drawn from an alphabet I had never seen. Decorative lines linked the constellations of symbols, lines with loops, curves with arrows, arcs with circles and triangles drawn on top of them. "Helen, what is this?" "Dad, it's math. It looks like you're, I don't know, worshipping the devil." "The devil? Really?" She started laughing. It was the first time I heard her laugh since she arrived 5 days earlier. "Lucifer? The Lord of Lies? Or is it flies? One of those. Ha!" "I'm not trying to be like, I don't know, Tipper Gore," I said. "I'm just saying, it looks a little wacko." She laughed so hard she fell out of the chair. She finally recovered and climbed back into it. "It's a problem for work. I'm trying to design a thermal stabilization system. These devil words, or whatever you think they are just stochastic tensors. The whole thing is just a huge stochastic differential equation problem." "What about this demon summoning thing? The pentagram?" She turned off the hilarity. "Now that's interesting. When you do the math, as I've clearly done here, it turns out that a star inside a circle is the optimum shape of the thermal elements we need to stabilize the..." She cut herself off, paused, and chose her next words carefully. "To stabilize the thing that needs stabilizing." I was going to press her. I know she works on classified projects at the lab and isn't free to say much about them, but I thought I could tease out a little more information about what she was actually doing with her life. But then she changed the topic to the subject I'd been dreading since that terrible and wonderful night that she was born. "Dad, when you adopted me, do you remember if you came across any information about my biological family? Specifically, about my biological father?" "Oh, Helen." I flopped onto the couch. "Why do you want to know about your father?" "It's not like I want to meet my birth family and try to get all kumbaya. Believe it or not, I have a professional interest in the subject." "Helen, nobody knows who your father is." "That's what I thought." Then she dropped the subject. My daughter, who pursues everything she's ever been interested in with a relentless white-hot intensity, simply dropped her questions about her own father. I hardly saw or even talked to Helen after that Christmas. Her visits home became infrequent. We would go 6 months or more between phone calls. Then she died. She was working on a project for the Army. Not at Livermore, they said. Somewhere else. There was an accident involving a high-energy experiment. She was killed along with 12 other scientists. Their bodies were vaporized. There were no remains. Losing a wife and a daughter is too much for one lifetime. I couldn't work after that. I had to retire. I grieved. I tried to kill myself. I spent 3 weeks in an institution. I somehow inched my way back to something that looks like a functional person. Then the mail started showing up. The Army apparently never stopped sending her paychecks. 6 months after Helen died, a rubber band-bound bundle of pay stubs with her name, but my address arrived in my mailbox. W-2 forms showed up next. Paperwork for benefits enrollment. Retirement account statements showing ongoing contributions. The paperwork that modern life produces kept coming. I called her HR office dozens of times. Their answer was always the same. "We're sorry for the confusion. We'll look into it." Then an envelope from a company named Parental DNA Analysis appeared in my mailbox. It was addressed to Helen. I tore it open while standing in the driveway. It contained the results of a paternity test. Child, Helen Kaizen. Father, hair sample supplied by client. Probability of paternity, 99.999999998%. Somehow before she died, Helen had found her father. She had found the person whose DNA entered her mother's embryo, and contrary to everything known about human development, produced a child. Or, she had at least produced a hair sample from the man who contributed half her genome. I saw Helen. She's changed. I was returning from running errands when she arrived at my house. I knew something was happening when I turned into my neighborhood. The streets were full of dogs. What looked to be every neighborhood dog, Labradors, Chihuahuas, and everything in between were running around like crazy. They were barking, growling, crying, jumping, and nipping at the air. Their owners were futilely running after them. I pulled into my driveway. There was a package next to the door. It was addressed to Helen. I lugged the heavy cardboard box into the living room. The package was only the size of a banker's box, but it was as heavy as a box of rocks. I sighed. Why was Helen's death nearly as strange as her birth? I wondered what I would be doing at that moment if the aneurysm hadn't taken my wife 2 decades earlier. Would I be happier? I opened the box. Inside was a steel case, the kind of case you'd use to ship something expensive and fragile. A post-it was stuck to the top of the steel case. On it, someone had written, "Dad, open this ASAP." I pulled the steel case out of the cardboard shipping box and thunked it down on the dining room table. I undid the heavy-duty latches and opened it. Inside was a tablet computer. Underneath that was hard plastic case. Another post-it note was stuck to the tablet screen. Turn me on, I did. It booted into a heavily customized version of the regular operating system and automatically started a messaging app. I typed a message. Hello? I waited a minute. Another minute. Someone finally typed a response. Dad, what is my mother's name? I started to cry. This was probably a joke or a crazily complicated scam, but the thought that maybe I was messaging Helen was too irresistible. I never saw her body. Her paychecks keep showing up in my mailbox. Why couldn't I be talking to her? Helen, where are you? Another long pause. Dad, I know who my father is. I met him. I need to find my mother. I know how I was born. I know you know who my mother is. Tell me her name and I'll tell you where I am. I truly didn't know her mother's name. The infant I performed the cesarean section on was less than half an hour old when I operated. She hadn't even been given a name yet. I don't know your mother's name, Helen, but I know your grandmother's name. Then I typed in the name of the woman who said my daughter was just excess tissue. A minute passed. Then 5. Was Helen gone? Open the smaller case. Turn the camera on. I pulled the black plastic case out of the steel box and opened it. Inside was a video camera nestled in a custom-cut foam insert. A sticker on the camera said, L Fleur calibrated, and the date less than 2 weeks earlier. It was an infrared camera from Lawrence Livermore. I found the power switch and waited for it to come to life. I typed into the tablet. It's on. I stared at the screen without blinking. She finally wrote, I'm in the backyard. I ran through the kitchen and flung open the back door. The yard was empty. I collapsed on the threshold and wept. Whoever I had been messaging to was not Helen. It was a joke. I heard a growl. The beagle who lived next door was standing by my backyard gate. The dog bared its teeth and snarled at my empty backyard. The dog thought something was there. Whoever I was messaging on the tablet said they were in my backyard. I'm slow sometimes. I realized the camera in my hand was there for a reason. I lifted the camera and scanned it across the yard. Something was there. Something huge, rendered in the infrared camera's garish shades of yellow, pink, and red, was standing directly in front of me. It was too close and too big to see all at once through the camera's narrow field of view. I started by aiming the camera at the grass. I saw 4 huge feet with long, 5-jointed toes protruding at odd angles. It was hard to get a sense of their size on the infrared, but my guess was that each foot was the size of yoga ball. I ran inside the house and slammed the door. I caught my breath and peered out the back window. To my naked eye, the backyard was still empty. I aimed the camera out the window. The same feet were visible in the infrared spectrum. I raised the camera. The thing had a body like, I don't know what. An upside-down dog merged with an octopus. It made no sense. Appendages with a dozen elbows sprouted irregularly from the body. The arms or tentacles or whatever you'd call them ended in hooves, bird feet, and human-like hands. One of the hands held a tablet computer identical to the one I left on the living room table. A face was senselessly placed on the side of the thing's body. There was no neck, nothing to even suggest a head, just a face stuck on the body like an afterthought. I aimed the camera at the face. The autofocus worked for a moment and the face became clear. It was Helen. She smiled. I flashed back to that moment, decades earlier, when I put my hand on the screaming baby's belly and felt Helen kick. My first reaction had been fear. I had felt terror and revulsion at the idea that somehow a baby had been born pregnant, that someone, something, had put its seed into an embryo and produced a creature. That same terror and revulsion filled me when I saw Helen's face on the side of the monster. Years ago, I was able to put my fear aside and do my job as a doctor, to deliver Helen into the world. I had to do the same thing today. I had to put my fear aside and do my job as a father. I flung the kitchen door open and shouted into the backyard. "Helen!" A pause, then new text on the tablet. "Goodbye, Dad." I needed the conversation to keep going. I couldn't let this insane situation be the last time I saw my daughter. I yelled, "I got the paternity test results! The hair sample was from your father!" "I know." "Who is he?" "A man who died a long time ago." Then she typed one last message to me. "Thank you, Dad. This is what I need to be doing now. There's only a 37.9% chance that I'll see you again. Sorry." I looked into the yard with the camera. She was gone. I began this post by saying that it wouldn't make sense unless I started at the beginning. Well, I did start at the beginning, and it probably still doesn't make any sense. I've gotten used to the idea that I'm not going to ever fully understand Helen's life, death, and whatever you call what came after. Given the few fragments of information I have, any decision I make about what I should do next is going to be half-baked. But baked or not, choosing a course of action will at least feel like forward motion. If I move forward long enough, then maybe I'll escape the despair that Helen left me with. There's one more thing I want to document here. If there's anyone that cares about what I've done and what I'm about to do, maybe it will help them understand my reasons. I stayed in bed for 3 or 4 days after I saw Helen, or the thing that wore her face. I got up a few times to trash the house, throw plates and glassware around, and knock over furniture. Eventually, I had to clean up. The last thing I put away was the steel box that held the tablet and the camera. As I was putting the items back in the box, I discovered something at the bottom of the steel container. The notebook Helen brought home for our last Christmas together. The notebook that I said looked like it belonged to a devil worshiper. I found the page that Helen was working on during that Christmas vacation. I know she said it was math stochastic differential equations and tensors, but it still looked satanic to me. The rest of the journal was filled with her research work. Most of the remaining 50 pages held nothing but math. Some of it looked like the satanic runes on the page with the pentagram, and some held the standard curvy integral signs and Greek letters that I remembered from my college calculus classes. Something on the last page caught my eye. A mess of computations that started 12 pages earlier ended with this line: selection ratio, = 0.379. The last thing Helen wrote to me included that same number. There's only a 37.9% chance that I'll see you again. I have spent the last 3 months studying those 12 pages of calculations. The main thing I've learned was that Helen was far more brilliant than I realized. Whatever problem she worked out on those last 12 pages drew from the fields of probability, statistics, game theory, population dynamics, Bayesian analysis, and non-Euclidean geometry. I went over the notebook again and again. What was 37.9%? What was she calculating? As far as I can tell, which isn't very far, she was studying some attribute of people who have died. There is nothing conclusive in her notebooks, so I have to guess. Based on data gathered in high-energy physics experiments at Lawrence Livermore, Helen calculated that 37.9% of people who die continue to experience some form of existence after death. With one exception, I don't regret anything that I've done in Helen's impossible life. I would do it all over again, from performing a cesarean section on a pregnant infant, to adopting the child I delivered, to saying goodbye to whatever it is that she became. The only regret I have is that I didn't learn her mother's name. I often think back to the day in the mall when Helen was 8 years old. She had no idea that the girl on the other side of the food court was her mother. But Helen sensed something, not a maternal bond or a vague sense of familiarity. Whatever 8-year-old Helen sensed in that child activated something dark inside of her. Helen said, "I want to eat her." I think she meant it literally. 8-year-old Helen said that eating her mother might help her get out one day. I don't know what she thought she needed to get out of, but if helping Helen get out of something she's stuck in can return me to her, then I'm going to help. I went online. I went to the courthouse and dug through moldering adoption paperwork. I hired a private investigator. I dug into the past and discovered the name of the infant who was my surgical patient on that terrible and wonderful night in 1982. That baby is an adult now. I found her address, her employer, her credit history. I didn't care about HIPAA regulations, privacy agreements, or anything like that. I gathered, bought, and stole all the information I could find about the family that I adopted Helen from. The box that contained that tablet, camera, and her notebook had a return address label on it, a P.O. box in Livermore, California. I put everything I learned about Helen's mother into an envelope and sent it to that P.O. box. One more task remains. A task that has a 37.9% chance of success. I need to see my daughter again. I need to exist in a universe where she also exists. I have decided to kill myself. It wasn't an easy decision. It was based on imperfect information and guesswork about Helen's research. But death feels like forward motion. Motion towards an existence where I can be with my daughter. Posting this strange memoir is my final living act. I have no family left to say goodbye to. My close friendships withered decades ago. Perhaps the information I've written here will be useful to investigators, or to people related to the woman who referred to my daughter as excess tissue. Hopefully, the information I sent to the P.O. box will make its way to Helen, and she will finally eat the woman who shares her birthday. Goodbye. If my daughter's calculations are correct, and my plan succeeds, there is a 37.9% I'll meet you one